Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to look back, I think, fondly on the career of the Honourable Nick Smith in a couple of years' time when he's languishing as an opposition backbencher, fondly remembering the halcyon days when he was the building and construction minister. And the image that I will have in my mind when I think back on Nick Smith's career is him giving a press conference with a 10-metre high pile of council planning documents teetering and about to collapse on his head, sir. And that was, in fact, that image, that photo stunt, which is so characteristic of the Honourable Nick Smith and his political career. It's the high watermark. It's the high watermark of the National Party's grand ambitions to reform the RMA. Because, sir, this bill is a ministerial white flag. This bill is an abject surrender after a decade of blaming the Resource Management Act for every economic ill, every setback, every disappointment, blaming the RMA for the Auckland housing crisis. That's what Nick Smith's been doing for the last 10 years. Nick Smith has been blaming expensive housing on the Resource Management Act. Now, sir, as David Parker said, we're going to vote for this bill. We're going to vote for it because, like so many of the bills that National brings to this House, particularly in the housing area, it is a small incremental measure that may bring some positive change. It's basically a 180-page collection of fairly incremental process improvements, and we'll talk some more in this debate and in subsequent debates about the detail of those improvements. But it is important for people to understand the backstory to this bill. And my colleague David Parker quoted the New Zealand Herald editorial that outlined the great political journey that the National Party's been on for the last decade about trying to weaken and gut the critical environmental principles in Section 6 and 7 of the RMA, and how they have been singularly unable to get the support of the country or this Parliament for ripping the guts out of the environmental protections of the RMA. But what they've done with this bill is bring something that doesn't, and this is the good news, it doesn't weaken the fundamental environmental protections in the Act, but what it also doesn't do is that it doesn't tackle the important RMA and planning rule blockages to urban development and affordable housing in this country that desperately need to be addressed. So it doesn't achieve the National Party's cherished goal of weakening the environmental principles, but it also doesn't do anything to tackle the root causes of the housing crisis. And I want to talk more about that. The speed of consenting, while it may be worthwhile, and it may be a positive thing to improve the speed and the efficiency of consenting, but it is not a root cause of the Auckland housing crisis. If it was, Nick Smith's policy of the special housing areas might have been hoped to have some effect, because they are nothing but small little mini fast-track consenting zones. But as we've discussed many times in this House, the special housing areas aren't making a blind bit of difference to the housing crisis and have resulted in only 500 houses being built in 2 whole years. So it's clear to everybody that the speed of consenting has nothing to do with the housing crisis. Now, we're voting for it because it might be a good thing. No one's going to complain if consenting is more efficient, it's cheaper. That will be a good thing, and we'll test that out. We'll test out in select committee whether the provisions in this bill will actually achieve that stated goal. But let's talk about what's actually been going on here. The National Party have been blaming the RMA for the housing crisis, trying to use RMA reform as some kind of Trojan horse, a cover for weakening the fundamental environmental protections in the bill. Meanwhile, over 7 years in government, they've done nothing to address the aspects of planning rules and local government's regulation of urban development that are one of the root causes of the housing crisis. And if the government was serious, Mr. Speaker, about reform in this area, it would, instead of this, the kind of tinkering that David Seymour used to characterise this bill, and I would say it's tinkering on an industrial scale, what the government would be doing right now is actually tackling the planning rules that are a root cause of the housing crisis, sir. And I want to talk about those too, because they are they're what's missing here. They are the, what should be in this bill. I think that most sensible people will acknowledge that the housing crisis in Auckland has, as one of its root causes, has been both the planning rules that stop the city growing out and stop the city growing up. And it's very clear that the urban growth boundary in Auckland has had the effect of creating an artificial scarcity of land that sees section prices being 10 times the value inside the urban boundary as land on the outside of the urban boundary. That has driven section prices up. It has set off a chain reaction, creating massive business opportunities for land bankers and speculators. And it's the reason the high cost of land in Auckland today is one of the main reasons that builders will not build affordable houses, not in Dr. Smith's special housing areas, and in fact nowhere in Auckland, because the land is too expensive. We cannot ignore also the plethora of planning restrictions that stop builders and developers building up. The restrictions on height and density. That's right. It stops people building affordable and housing and the kinds of housing that people want in places where they want to live, and that is in the city, in suburban and town centres. The combination of those two planning rules has created a pressure cooker in Auckland. And the only outlet for that pressure cooker has been the exponential increases in house prices that saw the average house price in Auckland City reach $918,000 only a couple of weeks ago. Fuel, and absolutely creating huge, it's a magnet for property speculators and land bankers, something this government refuses to do anything about. Mr. Speaker, those are the planning rules that are at the root of the housing crisis in Auckland. This bill does nothing about tackling them.
What would?
It is an exercise in avoidance. And Mr. Speaker, I want to read a quote from Jason Krupp of the New Zealand Initiative, who wrote a very good post the other day on the website interest.co.nz. And Jason Krupp and Dr. Smith, this is really good. You should listen to this because I think you'll find it very informative. Jason Krupp wrote, "The last 7 years have been characterised by weak, piecemeal workarounds, special housing areas, for example, while meaningful reform of urban development policy has been trapped in the minister's quixotic quest to reform sections 6 and 7 of the Resource Management Act. In the time it's taken to draft and shelve 2 versions of the RMA, a workable urban national policy statement could have been drawn up and implemented immediately." There's more, Dr. Smith. If Minister Smith is not willing to consider new ideas, at least there are others in the political process, I think he's talking about the Labour spokesperson, who recognise that if the tools you have at hand haven't solved your problem by now, it's time to consider new tools. So, Mr. Speaker, a national policy statement under the RMA that the Labour Party's been advocating for the last 3.5 years would fix these problems. That minister's done nothing in 7 years to tackle the root causes of the housing crisis. 2 years ago, he came to this House and said, you cannot do a national policy statement on urban development without changing sections 5 and 6. How he's proved to be wrong, because now he's scuttled away to his officials to get them to start drafting an urban policy statement. He has wasted 7 years blaming the RMA for the housing crisis. He brings this bill of modest process improvements to the House, and still he does nothing to address the root causes of the housing crisis.